Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Cup of Jonah. So, as you know, we've started a 5-day fast, a water fast today. So the first couple of days of a fast, it's best not to drink coffee, even if black, just because you want to make sure that your body is given the time to get fully into ketosis. So, if you're following us, then check it out. Last night we did kind of an introduction video, and then check the Substack because there'll be progress updates and people will be sharing their experiences and everything else like that. So just a little bit of water as our cup of Jonah this morning with the fasting salts, obviously. Okay. Yesterday we started this chapter, which we read almost 2/3 of it, called God is Not a Body. But most of the time, just to kind of recap and take a step back for a moment, most of the time for the reading yesterday, he was talking about the infinite and the finite, and can a finite power move in an infinite time, or undertake an infinite task, so to speak. And what's interesting is if you think about the word infinite, because remember we're working by way of remotion. Good morning, Meyer. So what we're saying is that God doesn't infinite, that word, without boundaries. So if you think about what is a body exactly, a body is that which gives a soul, a spirit, boundaries, right? So boundaries, limits, etc. So here, part of what we're asking is, can there be any limits to God, or does he have to be infinite without boundaries? So I think that's a big part of the question. Does God have a body? So we'll see more of that. But this question, we're going to start with the phrase here as we get back in. It says the fourth objection is this: the objections that he's been listing are all in response to this idea of a finite power moving in an infinite space, so to speak, or infinite time, during an infinite time. That's what he's raising objections to, that then he's kind of talking our way out of, or thinking our way out of. So the fourth objection is this: in those beings that in moving are not themselves altered, it does not seem necessary that what moves in an infinite time should have an infinite power. For such a motion consumes nothing of their power, so that after they have moved for a time, they were able to move for no less a time than before. Thus the power of the sun is finite, because its active power is not lessened by acting. it is able, according to its nature, to act on the sublunary world during an infinite time. What a cool word that is, sublunary. The world under the moon. To this, the reply is, as we have proved that a body does not move unless it be moved, if then it should happen that a certain body is not moved, that body will consequently not move. But in everything that is moved, there is a potency towards opposites, since the termini of motion are opposites. Therefore, of itself, every body that is moved can also not be moved. But what can not be moved is not of itself able to be moved through endless time, and hence neither to move through endless time. The above demonstration consequently holds of the finite power of a finite body, which power of itself cannot move in an infinite time. But a body that of itself can be moved and not moved, move and not move, can acquire perpetuity of motion from another. This must be incorporeal. The first mover must therefore be incorporeal. Thus, according to its nature, nothing prevents a finite body, which acquires from another a perpetuity in being moved, from likewise having a perpetuity in moving. For the heavenly body itself, according to its nature, can revolve the lower heavenly bodies with a perpetual motion, according as a sphere moves a sphere. Nor, according to the commentator, is it impossible, as it was impossible in the case of perpetuity of being, that what of itself can be moved and not moved should acquire perpetuity of motion from another. For motion is a certain flow out of the mover to the thing moved, and hence something moved can acquire from itself a perpetuity of motion that it does not have of itself. To be, on the other hand, is something fixed and at rest in being, and therefore of which that which of itself is in potency and non-being cannot, as Averroes himself says. That's the Eastern philosopher that he's mentioned a few times already. He says, following the course of nature, acquire from another a perpetuity of being. The fifth objection is that, following the above reasoning, there does not seem to be a greater reason why an infinite power is not in a magnitude rather than outside a magnitude. For in either case, it will follow that it moves in null time. To this, the reply is that in magnitude, time and motion, finite and infinite, are found according to one and the same notion, as is proved in Physics Books 3 and 4. Therefore, the finite in one of them removes a finite proportion in the others. But in beings without magnitude, or dimension, we would say, there is no finite or infinite except for equivocally. Hence, the aforementioned method of demonstration is not applicable amongst such potencies. There is, however, another better answer. The heavens have two movers, a proximate one with a finite power, which is responsible for the fact that they have a finite velocity, and a remote mover with an infinite power, which is responsible for the fact that their motion can be of an infinite duration. And thus it is evident that in infinite time, that is not in a magnitude, can move a body in time, but not immediately. But a power that is in magnitude must move immediately, since no body moves except by being moved. Hence, if it did not move, it would follow that it would move in null time. An even better reply to this: a power that is not a magnitude is an intellect, and moves by will. A power that is not in magnitude is an intellect, and moves by will. For we have proved that the intellect is not a corporeal power, Therefore, it moves according to the needs of the movable body and not the proportion of its power. Whereas a power that is in a magnitude can move only through the necessity of nature. Thus, of necessity, it moves according to the proportion of its quantity. Hence, if it moves in an instant. Thus, with the removal of the preceding objections, we will see that the argumentation of Aristotle stands. No motion, furthermore, which is from a corporeal mover, can be continuous and regular, because in local motion, a corporeal mover moves by pulling and pushing. Now, what is pulled or pushed is not uniformly disposed towards its mover from the beginning to the end of the motion, since at times it will be near and at other times further away. Thus, no body can move with a continuous and regular motion. But the first motion is continuous and is regular, as is proved in Physics Book 8. Therefore, the mover of the first motion is not a body. Again, no motion to an end that passes from potency to act can be endless, since when it reaches act, the motion comes to rest. If then the first motion is endless, it must aim at an end which is always and in all ways an act. But such an end is not a body or a power of a body, since all such things are movable either through themselves or by accident. Therefore, the end of the first motion is neither a body nor a power in a body, but the end of the first motion is the first mover, which moves as something desired. This, however, is God. God, therefore, is neither a body nor a power in a body. So it's interesting now how he's kind of using some of the arguments that we've talked about before and now applying them to this idea of what and using those, kind of drawing on those to establish an argument of whether or not God has a body. One of the reasons why this chapter seems a little bit more kind of more nuanced and kind of difficult to follow, frankly, is because a large portion of yesterday and the first part of today, he's talking about the heavenly bodies, which the ancients had a much different perspective on what the heavenly bodies were than we do. They had them as material beings or objects that had an infinite motion. And so that part of that last section that we read before we transition now to talking about something being moved by pushing or pulling, he was talking about this, whether or not a finite thing could move something infinitely. And he was talking primarily reasoning from the stars themselves and the heavenly bodies, and trying to understand more about the movability or immovability of God, or the corporeality of God, so to speak, without from those considerations of that infinite movement, which is a unique movement in their system. However, although according to our faith it is false that the motion of the heavens is perpetual, as will be made evident later on, yet it is true that it will not fail either through a failure of power in the mover or through corruption of the substance in the moved. And there is no evidence that the passing of time has slowed down the motion of the heavens. Hence, the above demonstrations do not lose their force. So now he essentially just kind of alluded to something similar as the Greeks, they saw the heavens to move in perpetuity and be infinite, but from the Christian perspective, we believe that there was a moment of creation. Okay. With this demonstrated truth, divine authority stands in agreement. For it is said in John that, quote, God is a spirit, and they that adore him must adore him in spirit and in truth, end quote. It is likewise said, quote, to the King of ages, immortal, invisible, the only God, end quote. Again, quote, the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by things that are made, end quote. The first one was from the Gospel of John, the second quote was from 1 Timothy, and the third is from Romans. For what is seen not by sight, but by the intellect, is incorporeal. Thereby is destroyed the error of the early natural philosophers who posited only material causes, such as fire or water or the like, and who thus said that the first principles of things were bodies and called them gods. Among them were some who further posited friendship and strife as moving causes. They too were refuted through the above arguments. For since according to them strife and friendship are in bodies, it will follow that the first moving principles are bodily powers. They also held that God is composed of the four elements and friendship, which would give us to understand that for them God is a heavenly body. Among the among the early thinkers, Anaxagoras alone approached the truth by positing that an intellect moved all things. By this truth, too, are refuted the Gentiles, who, taking their beginning in the errors of the philosophers we have listed, posited that the elements of the world and the powers in them are gods. For example, the sun, the moon, the earth, the water, and the like. By the same arguments, moreover, are set aside the wild fantasies of the simple Jews, Tertullian, the Vodiani or anthropomorphite heretics, who endowed God with a bodily figure, and also of the Manichaeans, who thought that God was a certain finite substance of light, stretched out through an infinite space. The occasion of all these errors was that in thinking of divine things, men were made the victims of their imagination, through which it is not possible to receive anything except the likeness of a body. This is why, in meditating on what is incorporeal, we must stop following the imagination. Interesting that in conclusion to that chapter, he kind of goes through some of the ponderings of the ancient philosophers and shows that they were mistaken in attributing a body to God in one way or another, which is interesting then, because then that we'll have to address later the mystery of the incarnation and whether or not that's possible. If God can't have a body, how does that work, right? Or if God doesn't have a body. It'll be very interesting pondering when the time comes. But it's interesting that he takes us back to what we spoke about a few days ago, or last week, I think it was, when I read a couple chapters of De Ente Essentia, or on Being in Essence, where we're warned that a small error in the beginning can become a great error. And I had connected it to the idea that men especially rely too much on our imagination under the age of 40. So here he actually explicitly says, I didn't remember he said this here. The occasion of all the aforementioned errors was that in thinking of divine things, men were made the victims of their imagination, through which it is not possible to receive anything except the likeness of a body. So in other words, what he's saying is, in our mind, the images that we fashion in our mind come from what? Our senses, which are, where do we get our information from? Bodies. That we sense other things with our bodies, or we sense other bodies with our senses. And that's what forms the images in our imagination. So when we rely too heavily on the imagination, especially when trying to reason about incorporeal things, we need to make sure that, that's when we fall into error, by attributing to incorporeal things corporeal qualities. So now it makes sense why he would spend such a long time. He spent almost as long trying to show in various ways and get rid of every possible explanation of, or every possible understanding of God that could include a body. He evaluated every scenario, right? To exclude one by one every possible way that one could conceive of God being a body, and disqualified all of them. And the reason is interesting that he ties in the end. He ties it all up by saying this is why we have to be very careful about our imagination, because all we can imagine is a corporeal body, a physical body. That's where our imaginations come from. So we have to be careful. So I like that. It's a nice little summary there. So tomorrow we're going to ask that we're going to talk about God and is he his essence? And Thomas claims he is, so we'll see why. And then we're going to ask whether or not being and essence are the same in God, and whether or not whether or not an accident is in God, and so on. Now we're getting close to where we're going to start to talk about the divine perfection, and then then there's an interesting transitional chapter 32 and 33. Those are very interesting transitions in actually 31, 32, 33, if I'm not mistaken. But he goes about so after we talk about the various perfections of God, so we're going to say that he's simple. We're going to look at different levels of his being, at the substance level, at the essence level, and then at the existence. We're going to look at whether or not all of those are the same or not. But then we're going to look at the perfection of God and some other perfections of God, right? Okay, fine. So we're all kind of talking about the essence of God and trying to understand by way of remotion again what God isn't. Then he asks a very interesting. I'm just going to a little bit of a teaser trailer for you, because this last chapter was a little bit of a slog to get through, right? Very different cosmology to ours, a little kind of hard to grasp, especially when you can't see it and read it to kind of follow. Okay, wait. So don't feel discouraged if that was your experience, because reading it is a little bit hard to follow as well. But just kind of the way he's taking if this then that, okay, not this, if okay, well, if that, then if this other thing and that other thing. So it's just kind of like all these conditional arguments and just drawing, kind of bracketing off impossibilities. But once we finish this whole definition now, as we move forward, again, once we finish the way of remotion of kind of understanding what God is not, then we're going to turn to whether or like how we use words, what we say words of, and how, if at all, we can say anything positive, make any claims, so to speak, or apply any name to any characteristic in God. And this is an important this is an important question, because otherwise, if the answer to that is no, or if we don't understand exactly how we can do that, then the rest of the book is pointless, because we can't say anything or know anything truly beyond the way of remotion where we cut things off, right? So cut off imperfections. So good. So we're getting there, and it's going to be this again. Thank you for your patience. It's been a little bit of a slog the last couple of days, but I appreciate you guys joining me for Cup of Jonah. Remember to share if you're enjoying this. phoneboothpodcast.substack.com. Please subscribe, so you can find all the updates and everything. And then if you haven't considered it yet, consider joining on the Philosopher King tab on the Substack, you'll see there's a post for the fast. So if you do want to join us for a couple days or for 5, there's a little graph there too of what's going on in your body with the passage of the hours. So you can see day 3 is when human growth hormone spikes, then it tapers off, and then that's when the different stem cell systems in your body start to spike, where those stem cells heal, separate and heal your body and everything. So we're gonna do that for 5 days. So it's gonna be great. But thank you for joining us, and for a cup of Jonah, and I will see you guys tomorrow morning. Actually, I almost forgot. Tonight, we have a Philosopher King at 7 p.m. Eastern, and we're gonna have Snoop on tonight. Actually, so it's a long time coming. Great guy to talk to, and I know most of you know him pretty well already. So we're gonna spend some time together this evening and dive deep with you. So join us 7 p.m. EST on Philosopher King this evening, and then I will see you guys again tomorrow morning for a cup of Jonah. Have a good rest of your day. We'll see you later tonight.